Now that we've got our Flutter development environment set up, let's put together a quick to-do list for our Bullseye game. Our user is given a target score that they want to hit, say 47. They move the slider on a scale from 1 to 100 to be as close to the target value as they can get it. They then tap the Hit Me button to show the result of a round. Then they're off to the next round. The game shows the total score and the round number, and the user can start the game over if they wish, or tap an Info button to get information about the game. Here's the first set of items we'll need to do. Add a Hit Me button to the screen, show a pop-up when the user taps that button, put some game info on the screen, such as what the current score is and what the round number is, put a slider on the screen and make it go between the values 1 and 100, read the value of the slider after the user taps the Hit Me button. We'll also need to generate a random number at the start of each round and display it on the screen. That is the target value. Next, calculate the score, which is based on the difference between the random number and the value of the slider. That should be displayed in the pop-up after you tap Hit Me. Add the Start Over button on the screen. If you tap it, it should reset the score and put the player back into the first round. Put the app in landscape orientation and make it look pretty. With our programming to-do list together, it's time to dive in and work on our first item, adding the Hit Me button. So at long last, it's time to open Visual Studio Code and create your first Flutter project. And along the way, you'll learn a little bit about the Dart language and using the iOS simulator and Android emulator. As we get started, you might not understand every single line of code right away, or what all the strange syntax means, especially if you've never done computer programming or Flutter development before. That's okay. All that's important at this stage of the course is that you get the general idea of what's going on. As you proceed through the course, you'll go over these concepts again and again until they solidify in your mind. It's all about learning via repetition. Okay, so I'm going to get started in Visual Studio Code, and from here we're going to create the Flutter skeleton project for the Bullseye app. The Visual Studio Code Flutter extension has a tool built into it that lets you create a template project. To access that tool, you'd hit Command-Shift-P on Mac or Control-Shift-P on Windows or Linux. That opens up the command palette in Visual Studio Code, and you start typing Flutter, and you see the Flutter-related commands that you have available to you. So from here, you hit Return on New Project, and that's going to create a Flutter template project for you. Instead of doing that, I'm going to run you through the steps to create a Flutter project manually. That way you get to see exactly what's going into this Flutter project. So from here, I'll hit Escape, and then I can click Open Folder or hit this tab here and click Open Folder. And I'll create a new folder called Bullseye. This will be the root folder of our project. Click Create, then Open. Now I need to create a file named pubspec.yaml or pubspec.yaml. This is a configuration file for the Flutter project. So I'll go to the File menu, say New File, hit Text Editor, then File, Save As, and call it pubspec.yaml. And it goes into our root project folder. Click Save. The pubspec.yaml file determines the configuration of our Flutter project. I'm going to add just the bare amount of code that we need to this file for a very basic project. First, I add a name for the project, which will be Bullseye. Then a description. Next, I add dependencies for the project. The dependencies section is where you add dependencies for your project. We're only going to depend on the Flutter SDK itself for now. Dev dependencies are for dependencies that are just specific to development. We don't really need to worry about the distinction between dev dependencies and dependencies at this point. And the last thing I need to do is say that my project is going to depend on the material design widgets. Material design is the design language used for Android. And we have an episode later in the course that will talk about the difference between material design widgets and what are called Cupertino widgets. For now, we're just going to stick with material design. So we set uses material design to true. So that finishes the pubspec.yaml file. Again, this is the bare minimum that we need for a Flutter project. If you went down the path of using the new project template from the command palette, it would create this file for you. Next, I'm going to create a lib folder. So I go to the Bullseye folder here, and there's an icon for a new folder. Click that, and I'll call it lib. The lib folder is where all of our Dart code for the project is going to live. The first file we need is called main.dart. So I select the lib folder and click new file here. And I just call it main.dart. And I see this pop up over here for get packages. So I want to click that. You see it was running something called Flutter pub get. If that pop up disappeared before you had a chance to run it, one thing you could do is go to the terminal and cd into your project folder. So I'll do cd Bullseye, and I'll run ls. That shows me the pubspec.yaml file and the lib folder that I made. So from here, you can run flutter pub get. And what this does is pull down the dependencies that we have for our project. Since I already ran that from Visual Studio Code, all the dependencies are set. So go back to VS Code. Main.dart is going to be the entry point for our app. It's the first thing that's going to run when our app starts. I'm going to go through a lot of Dart code and add it into main.dart. You don't need to really understand the code that's being added for now. It's all going to be explained as we go through the course. For now, I'll just explain it to the extent needed for this episode. The first thing we need is an import for our material design widgets. And I add a semicolon at the end of the line. All Dart statements have to end with a semicolon. The squiggly line under the material Dart import is just telling us that we haven't used anything from that import yet. Next, I'm going to add a class for our app, and I will call it Bullseye app. And it's going to extend from something called a stateless widget. You're going to be hearing a lot about widgets in the course. Almost everything you work with in Flutter is a type of widget. And a stateless widget is one of the most important widgets that you'll work with. The app for your Flutter project itself is going to be a type of widget, in this case, a stateless widget. There's another type of widget called stateful widget that we'll see in a moment. Both stateless widgets and stateful widgets have to override what's called the build method. The build method is what Flutter uses to draw the widgets to the screen. So now I'll add that override for the build method. I just type in build, and I see something that's highlighted, so I hit return. And that puts in a version of the build method that I can use and gives me a to-do to implement the function. So I'll delete everything inside the function. And now I'm going to return a material app for our Bullseye app. And I give the material app a title. And a theme. And a home value. And I need my semicolon after the return statement. The home value is a game page, which we're going to create in a minute. Now that I have my Bullseye app, I need to start it up by calling it from the main function. The main function is the entry point for your Flutter app. So above the class, I'm going to add that main function. There's some syntax here that we'll describe later in the course. But for now, all you need to know is that main is calling the run app function, and it's taking in an instance of your Bullseye app. Okay, so next we need to create that game page. Game page is going to be a stateful widget. I'll scroll down to the bottom of the code and add the game page stateful widget. The difference between stateful widgets and stateless widgets is, you guessed it, that stateful widgets have state. We're going to add state into our game page a little bit later on. For now, we're just going to add a title. The title has a type called string. And above the title, we're going to add what's called a constructor function for game page. Again, there's some more syntax here that we'll describe later in the course. For now, just know that this game page function is used to create a game page object. Like the widgets need a build function, a stateful widget needs to have a create state override. So we'll add that now. And that's going to return a game page state object. And I need to add the return type at the beginning of this function. And I need to add the override tag. So game page state is the state that goes along with the game page stateful widget. I prepended game page state with an underscore, which means that it's private to this file. And now we'll create the game page state class. So game page state extends state, and this is saying that game page state is the state for game page. Like our Bullseye app, we need to override the build method. So I can type build and then hit return, and I get an empty build method. Inside this build method is where we're going to build the user interface for the game page stateful widget. So first I'm going to return a scaffold. A scaffold is a structure on which you can hang other user interface elements. And a scaffold needs a body. Inside the body, we're going to put a center widget. And the center needs a child, which is going to be a column. And you can see here that I'm adding commas after these widgets that are being added. That's because the commas help Visual Studio Code format your code correctly. The column needs children. And the children are an array of widgets. So first I'm going to add a text widget. And inside the text, I'm going to put Hello Bullseye. And I'll give the text a style. And below the text, I'll add a button called a flat button. And the flat button needs a text widget. And it also needs an onPressed parameter. The column widget also takes something called an axis alignment. So we're going to add a main axis alignment before the children. So here we're telling the column to center along its main axis. And then the last thing we need is to add a semicolon after the scaffold here. Okay, so that's the code we need for our bare bones app. Again, I added a lot of code, and you don't need to really understand what's going on here in this Dart code. We're going to walk through all of it later in the course. For now, we just want to run the app. Because I created the project manually, we need to go to the command line. And then from the root project folder, Bullseye, we're going to run a command flutter create dot. This is going to create the iOS and Android projects that the Flutter app needs to run on iOS and Android. So I'll hit return. If I go back to Visual Studio Code now, you see that these other folders were created, like Android and iOS, and then some other files were added as well. So that flutter create command builds out the Flutter project that we were building manually. If you had used the template project from the command palette, all of that would have been created for you already. I have an Android emulator running right now. If you don't, you can either use Spotlight with Command Spacebar to start the iOS simulator if you want, or you can go to Android Studio and open up the AVD Manager, and from here you can run one of your Android emulators. Go back to the command line and clear my terminal and run the flutter doctor command. It confirms that I have one connected device, which is the Android emulator that I'm running. You don't need to run Flutter Doctor every time you want to run your app. Just wanted to show it to you here just to make sure that we see that there is a connected device. And now I'll enter Flutter Run and switch to the emulator. So this is building the project using the Android SDK. And when the build is complete, it will run the app on the Android emulator. All right, there we have our Hello Bullseye text widget and our Hit Me button running inside a Flutter app on an Android emulator. I can go back to the terminal and hit Control-C, which closes the app. Now I'll go back to VS Code. So we use the Flutter Run command from the command line, but usually you'll want to start the app directly from Visual Studio Code. To set that up, go to this tab here in Visual Studio Code and click this Run and Debug button. Now you need to click this configuration drop-down and choose Dart and Flutter, and then choose Flutter App. You'll only need to do that the first time you run the app from VS Code. If I go back to the emulator, I see the app running in the emulator again. When we ran from VS Code, we got this toolbar here that shows us the running app. I can hit the stop button to stop the app from running. Now that we've run the app in the Android emulator, let's see how to run it in the iOS simulator. So I'll hit Command Spacebar and type in simulator. Once the simulator is up and running, you see down in the bottom right of the VS Code window that it's switched to targeting the iPhone 11 Pro that I have running. If I click on this menu here, that lets you switch between different devices that you have available. So right now I have the iPhone 11 Pro running and the Pixel 3 with API 30 running. So if you have both simulators and Android emulators running, you can pick between them from here. I'll hit Escape. So the fact that this says iPhone 11 Pro in the bottom means when I run the app, it's going to run on the iPhone. To run it, I can either click this play button here, or if I hit Control F5, that's going to run the app on the simulator. Go back to the simulator now. So earlier we built the project using the Android SDK. Now that we're targeting the iPhone, Flutter is going to use Xcode to build the app for iOS and then run it on the iOS simulator. You see here at the bottom that it says running Xcode build. And then when Xcode build is done, the app will start up on the simulator. And there we have it, the same app running this time on iOS. At this point, you could try running the app on a device as well. We have an episode later in the course that will show you how to do that. If you have an Android device, you can pretty much just plug in the Android device and make sure you have developer options set up on the device. At that point, the device will show up in this menu here, and you can run the app on Android. Running on an iPhone is a little bit more involved, and we'll talk about that later in the course. One last thing we want to see before we move on to the next episode is the Flutter feature known as Hot Reload. Hot Reload means that we can make changes to our user interface without having to restart the running app on an emulator, simulator, or device. So I'm going to resize my VS Code window. I'll pull the simulator over here to the right and then resize the VS Code window so I can still see the emulator. Down here, I will hide the debug console by clicking this X. Now I'm going to change the text here in Hello Bullseye to be welcome to my first app. And there you have it. The text changes right away in the running app without having to rebuild the project. Hot Reload is something we're going to use throughout the course. There will be a few times where we do have to stop the app and restart it, but I will point those out when they happen.